Thanks, Megan. Yeah, so keeping the security theme going a little bit now. So for those who don't know me, I am Dan Smith, work for LINX as a cybersecurity governance and risk manager, which might give you a little bit of a clue as to some of the things I'm going to be focusing on today. Yeah, really want to give you an oversight of some of the work that we're doing in terms of information security management, and like my job title suggests, focusing on that sort of the governance aspects of that and how we've sort of gone about implementing it. A little bit of context and background then first of all. So we have, as an organization, traditionally been viewed by the UK government as what they would call critical national infrastructure. So as alongside other sort of major telecoms providers, we've always sort of been deemed to be important within the wider telecoms infrastructure within the UK. So that's obviously always meant that security has been something that we've had to take very seriously. We've always sort of been in the eye side of the government in that respect. And then in 2018, as Des mentioned in his talk just now, the NIS regulations came into force. And one of the things that these did was to call out our internet exchange points as an essential service. So essentially what that meant was that we were now regulated by Ofcom under those regulations, and that actually sort of formalized a set of security obligations on us. I'll talk a little bit more about what those are later on. So one of the things that we then decided to do sort of around 2020, 2021 was to try and formalize some of our sort of security framework. And we decided that ISO 27001 was quite a good way of implementing that. So we achieved certification to the 2013 standard for the first time in 2021. And then very kindly, less than a year later, they decided to publish a new version of the standard. So we sort of got the band back together, started working to implement the revised standards, 2022. And so then in 2024, for the first time, we sort of recertified and transitioned to the 2022 version. So I'll sort of start then by just giving a bit of an overview. I'm sure a lot of you in the room are familiar with ISO 27001 and that approach to information security management, but I'll just do a quick overview of what that means, and then look at how we've chosen to implement that within LINX. And then I mentioned that we are regulated by Ofcom under the NIS regulations. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that means and how we use sort of information security management to support our regulatory compliance in that area. And then just conclude with some final thoughts about what we found to be sort of the value of this, and how we've sort of seen some of the benefits that have arisen from the journey that we've been on. So again, a quick recap then about ISO 27001. Much like the Des was saying about the TSA, it's not really an information security standard, it's an information security management standard. So it's really a governance framework that is basically sets out the requirements for implementing a information security management system. So it doesn't really tell you how you should go around securing things. What it tells you to do is how you put processes in place to determine for yourself how to secure things. So it doesn't give you a nice sort of checklist of controls that you can just go away and implement and then be secure. What it says to you is you need to go away and do a risk assessment, find out what your risks are, and then see what controls you need to implement to mitigate those risks. So then when it comes to sort of the audit time, they're obviously interested in how you secure your assets and what controls you have in place, but they are more interested in making sure that the system but how you manage those, behind how you manage those controls is in place and up to standard and is functioning properly. So the standard itself is separated into two parts. So the first main part consists of 11 clauses. The first 0 to 3 are just sort of introductory. So really the main meat of the standard is in clauses 4 to 10. And those are really the requirements for how you go about implementing your ISMS. So those are the sort of the mandatory requirements that you have to be compliant with. They want to see that that is functioning before you go into anything else. And then there's a second part called Annex A, which sort of provides the guidelines for 93 sort of control objectives and controls. I'm not really going to focus on Annex A today because basically those controls are optional. You have to do your risk assessment and then see which controls apply. So it's really those sort of clauses 4 to 10, that governance framework, that's sort of the mandatory aspect and where you see the most value from sort of having that behind the scenes structure in place. So in terms of those sort of requirements, it sort of takes you through. So it starts by requiring you to sort of look at the context of your organization, what you do, who your stakeholders are, what interests they have, and what the scope should be. And then it takes you through a requirement that you have senior management support. So you have sort of the leadership behind you and committing resources to what you're trying to do. Then it goes into planning, which is very much focused on making sure that you're doing your risk assessment and you've got a plan for treating risks. Support is then how you have appropriate resources in place. Do you have competent staff? Do you have essentially the roles and responsibilities defined and people acting in support of the framework? Do people understand what they've got to do? Operation, very much focused on operational planning and how you go about doing that. And then the last two, you're looking at how do you actually evaluate that what you've done is working? How do you know that it's performing as you want it to? And then how do you go about improving it? So very much based on this idea of sort of continuous improvement. And it's all based around this idea of an information security management system, which is sort of designed to provide a bit of a systematic approach to managing your information security. So a sort of fully functioning ISMS should sort of start by defining your information assets. So you actually understand what you have and what you want to protect, how critical they are, who has ownership of them. And then it sort of provides the assessment of the risks against each of those assets. So, what could cause harm to them, what could go wrong, what controls you've got in place, and what controls you don't have in place. You've got an awareness of how well protected those assets are. Then a plan of action. So, okay, obviously, you can never protect anything 100%. So if a security breach happens, what's your plan of action? How do you respond? And how do you have processes in place to be able to do something about it? And then finally, who has responsibility? So sort of for each step, have you identified people who have responsibility so things don't sort of fall through the cracks? And there is sort of an ownership in place to manage that. So in terms of then how we've gone about it at LINX, so we sort of follow this continual improvement cycle, plan, do, check, act. So this actually originated in sort of quality management, but has found its way into information security management as well. But essentially, it's this sort of continual improvement cycle that you go through and iterate. And it starts really with making sure that you've got an effective plan in place, that you've established what you're trying to achieve, that you've got support for it. Once you've come up with a plan, you put that plan into action. So you implement your controls, you train your staff. Then you check that it's working as you want it to. You identify any problems, and then you go away and fix those problems. You improve it, and then you go back into the plan phase and go through the next cycle, hopefully improving every time. So what does that sort of mean then in practice? Certainly from the way that we've approached it, we started off sort of at the beginning. So working out, first of all, what we wanted our sort of information security management system to achieve. How was that aligned with our objectives as an organization? Because there's very little point in implementing this whole security program if it's going to run completely counter to what your organization is trying to achieve. So making sure that those objectives were aligned, and that gave us something then to be able to measure whether we were actually achieving. So we could look back and say, these are the objectives we've set. Let's check whether we're actually meeting them and how well we're doing against them. Then obviously we had a proposal to put to the management team. So every 6 months, we sit down with the senior management team. We go through things like the objectives and metrics and identify any issues within the system. So we sort of have that continual management support for delivering it. And that's obviously important, not only because that they're running the organization, they need to understand what's going on, but also they're the people who can allocate resources, they can fix problems. So it's important for us to make sure that we've got that awareness at the sort of senior levels of the organization. Then we got on to selecting the sort of the implementation scope. So actually, how and where do we want to apply this sort of ISMS to? So we actually have sort of two scopes for this. We have the scope of the ISMS, which sort of applies to the whole organization. For ISO 27001, for our certificate purposes, we have a sort of subset of that scope focused only on the UK. That's simply because it's a bit of a pain to have auditors go and visit every data center that we have around the world. So as we manage pretty much everything from the UK for our certification purposes, we limit it to the UK. And then finally, define our risk assessment methodology. So we use a sort of asset threats vulnerabilities model based around identifying risks to our assets. That was something that we actually had in place pre ISO 27001. I did give a presentation on that in some detail a few meetings ago, so I won't go into that now, but can certainly talk more about that at a later date. Moving on then to the sort of second part of the cycle, we've sort of got our plan in place. So then obviously we understand what our risks are. Then we've got to identify how we can do something about them. So not only looking at what controls we have in place, but also looking at areas that we may not have controls, or we may not have controls that are at a level that we would like. So especially focused on our critical assets and making sure they're well protected. If they're not, then making sure that we're doing something about that and feeding that through. And the other key thing is obviously making sure that those risks and those assets have people who own them. So we have a person who's responsible for them, to make sure that they're actually don't get missed and that someone has accountability and responsibility for managing those. Then we move on to designing our sort of policies and procedures. So making sure that we've got those in place where appropriate to manage those risks. We certainly found that there were a lot of consultants and internet sites who would offer you sort of templated policies to be ISO compliant. A lot of them we found were not particularly suitable. We really found the value in taking time to tailor these sort of policies and procedures to our organization so that they were relevant to actually what we do, fitted with our structures and processes. And while that took obviously a bit more time and a bit more effort to get right, I think we certainly found that it was definitely worth it in that respect. And then finally, allocate resources and training staff. So we had a sort of core project team in place, delivering that sort of with, obviously, I lead on the governance aspects. Then we've obviously got the sort of the security team who lead on the technical aspects and control implementation. And that's all sort of overseen again by the senior management team, and ultimately is reported up to the board. So having got that in place, we then spend some time actually monitoring the implementation of this. So we have quite a strong set of performance metrics that we use. So we track those throughout the year. As I mentioned, we have sort of these 6 monthly review meetings with the senior management team where we can look at those and identify how we're performing against them. So that gives us a bit of a benchmark to look at to make sure that we're performing as we would like. And obviously, if we're not, we can identify where we need to make improvements. Likewise, we go through over a 12-month period, whole set of internal audits where we look at all the various requirements. We speak with the key staff and we do an audit of each area. So again, we get an understanding on a sort of continuous basis as to where the gaps are, what's working, what's not, so we can actually start fixing them before an external auditor or a regulator comes in and says, this is broken, you probably should have been aware of it. And then finally, once we've identified the sort of gaps or things that aren't working, non-conformities, as we would call them in ISO speak, we get on to the sort of final stage of the cycle. So we obviously want to correct anything that's going wrong, and we feed that through into our sort of, we have a tracker that tracks everything that's identified through the internal audit process. Again, that's assigned ownership, that has someone to see it through to make sure that it's fixed. But we also want to obviously identify the root cause because it's not much use correcting something if it's then just going to break again the next year. So we try and identify what the root cause was, try and eliminate it. And so next time, hopefully, that doesn't break again. And likewise, we sort of take through various mechanisms, ideas, feedback from staff about how things are landing. So we get an idea as to actually how these things are landing on the ground. So if we have a policy, are staff comfortable with it? Is it easy to follow? Our process is clear? All that feedback sort of comes in and allows us to sort of improve it through the next iteration. So having sort of established this, I want to talk a little bit about how we use that to support some of our sort of regulatory obligations. So this sort of, as I mentioned earlier, we are designated as an essential service under the NIS regulations. So these are currently being updated, as Des mentioned, by the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. That's actually not going to change sort of the main requirements that we're under. So those will pretty much remain the same. And those requirements are sort of twofold. So we have an obligation to take appropriate and proportionate technical and organizational measures to manage risks and ensure the security and service continuity of our network and information systems. So we have to demonstrate to Ofcom essentially that we are taking security seriously and that we're managing risks appropriately. And then we have another obligation, which is to notify Ofcom of any security incident that has a significant impact on the continuity of the services we provide. So essentially, if we have a security incident or a significant outage on our network, we have to inform Ofcom within a fairly limited time frame and provide them with details of the incident. And obviously, they will then follow up with further questions as necessary. So in terms of then how Ofcom go about enforcing this, obviously, the requirement within the legislation itself is fairly high level. Okay, you've got to have security and appropriate risk management. Well, what does that actually mean in practice? What does good look like? Well, they use a sort of a formal assurance program, which is based on something the NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Centre, have put together called the Cyber Assessment Framework, which is essentially a set of, I think there are 39 outcomes that you have to meet. So there's it's essentially a set of statements, and for each statement covering various aspects around governance, risk, and controls, you've got to demonstrate how you are achieving that that outcome. So it's not necessarily saying that there's only one way to achieve it. There could be many ways, but you've ultimately got to convince Ofcom that what you're doing is sufficient to be able to meet that standard. And the way Ofcom sort of measures that and sort of gathers that information is through what they call formal legal notices. So under the NIS regulations, they have a power to essentially formally, legally require you to provide them with the information that they're seeking. And you're required to provide that within the timeframes that they set. and in a complete and accurate manner. So essentially, you've got to be honest with them, and you've got to give them as much information as you can. So they send sort of fairly large spreadsheet of questions. Runs to tens of pages. So we've been through a couple of these now, but essentially it's asking you to provide information on sort of all aspects of your sort of security controls, your security program, what your governance looks like, what your risks looks like. In the past, they've asked for copies of policies and processes and other evidence to check that you're meeting that. So for us, certainly, I think having this sort of information security management system has helped us in a couple of ways dealing with things like this. First of all, I think it's saved us a lot of time. I mean, these are fairly lengthy requests that require fairly substantial resources. It helps us a great deal to already have a lot of this stuff in place already. So we have the documentation ready to be able to provide to them. So it means that we're not really scrabbling around trying to put stuff together or trying to sort of wordsmith while we don't have stuff. So that's really been helpful. And second of all, it means that even when we do have gaps or we do have areas where we're perhaps not as strong as we would like to be, we're already aware of that, and we've got a plan in place because we've picked it up through our sort of internal audit, our monitoring. So we can explain to Ofcom that, okay, we may not have exactly what you want to see at the moment, but we're aware of it. This is our plan, and we're working on it, which is obviously a much better position to be in than having to explain that, you know, we didn't actually realize that this was broken until you sort of brought it to our attention. Really sorry. So just to finish then with a few sort of final thoughts around what we've sort of seen as the value of this sort of information security management within LINX. I think, first of all, obviously, it's always really nice to have a shiny certificate that you can put on the wall and send to people. But, you know, you could probably collect several of those through various different things. And it's not really any value to you unless you've actually put in place a sort of operational core that you can trust. So certainly the benefit and the value that we've seen is really having that governance framework in place, that to be able to rely on it and to be able to use it to be able to improve processes, procedures, and essentially make everyone's life run a little bit smoother. The certificate is really sort of just a nice thing to have. Effective implementation starts with risks. So again, we've certainly seen for us the value very much being in understanding what our assets are and going through that sort of systematic process. So we understand what they are, where they relate to, who has ownership of them, what controls are in place, what the risks are, and then tying those to actions and reviews. So again, putting in place that sort of systematic process for managing risk has been really helpful, rather than playing a bit sort of whack-a-mole where things go wrong and you try and fix them, and then something else goes wrong and you have to sort of run over there and try and fix that. It sort of gives us a much more systematic approach to try and deal with some of that stuff. And then finally, it sort of moves us away a little bit from a sort of check the box mentality, where, you know, you sort of, if a regulator comes asking questions, then you hurriedly try and sort of keep them happy and wordsmith your responses in such a way to sort of keep them from beating down your door, to this sort of more of a culture of continuous monitoring and embedding sort of risk management and information security management in day-to-day processes. So they become much more of people's sort of daily work cycles, rather than a sort of mad rush once a year to try and please an auditor or a regulator. So that hopefully gives you a bit of an insight into some of the stuff that we've been doing. Happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thanks. I possibly could do it without using the mic, but then other people wouldn't. Yeah. So what would be the one thing that, if you were to speak to yourself back when you started this journey, what bit of advice would you give yourself?
I would say try not to do everything at once. Certainly, when we looked at it, it was fairly overwhelming, or could be fairly overwhelming in terms of the sheer number of documents that you needed to have in place, the scope of things that you would uncover. Like a lot of these things, I think when you embark on the process, you turn over stones, and there's a lot more in your organization going on that you maybe weren't aware of. And so being able to sort of take a deep breath and a step back and realize that you don't have to fix everything immediately, which is where I think starting from the beginning has really helped. So once you sort of go through the risk assessment and identifying the assets, and then it becomes easier, even if you can't fix everything, to at least have a process in which things can get fixed later on. And so certainly one of the things that we found going through our first audit was we didn't necessarily have to have everything working perfectly, and we still don't, obviously, because probably nobody does. But we did need to have a framework in place that those things, we were aware of those things, and we had a plan for fixing them at some point, even if that point wasn't necessarily now. So it's a bit like you can have some wet paint, but ultimately you've got to have a plan for making sure that dries at some point.
Hello, Tom from Barn. Congratulations on your journey through this. It's amazing to see all the details that you're putting up here and everything else. My question's around the company culture in adopting this, because I agree on that actually it's not the certificates that you can put the little badge on the website. It's actually what it means for the operation of the business and actually doing the thing. What was it like? Did you have to go through a culture shift? From going from tick boxes through to actually this is part of everybody's daily work cycles and you do it anyway?
Yeah, it's definitely a transition. I think not least because you're formalizing a lot of stuff, you're putting in place new policies and processes which are essentially having an impact on people's jobs because, okay, suddenly now I'm not allowed to do this. But I think what we found was that you can bring people with you. So by sort of seeking feedback, again, on how do you actually find these things work in practice, working with people to make sure that we were designing processes that worked with how they did their jobs, and also sharing what the sort of overall aim was. So, because ultimately a lot of this makes your life in the long run easier, because it means that you're not firefighting all the time, right? When something goes wrong, it means that things aren't breaking when you're not expecting them to. So actually, once people, I think, sort of came around to it as a helpful thing in terms of how they do their jobs, it stops being seen as necessarily so much of a barrier. I think a lot of that is really about information and sharing information and being willing to work with people rather than taking a sort of top-down approach where you're saying, oh, well, the security team is telling you to do this. You've got to go do it. Like, we're not going to give you any more information. And so one of the things that we do, we have sort of monthly information security forum meetings, and we always have an item on the agenda, which is just sort of general feedback from staff about security, how it's landing, what people are saying, how it's working for people. So if people are having problems or they're unhappy about something, we might not be able to fix it necessarily in the way they would like, but at least we can sort of work with them to try and improve things. So we've certainly found that that's been a kind of a two-way process rather than necessarily a top-down thing. But yeah, it's definitely an important consideration.
No, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much.